One of the biggest benefits to cloud computing is we have this elasticity concept. We can build auto-scaling applications that scale out and scale back in based on different rules that we configure based on the activity coming from our end users. But we do have two different ways we can scale. We can scale vertically, we can scale horizontally. So let's talk about the difference between the two. So when it comes to scaling up vertically, typically you'll see this when you're working with virtual machines. So for example, let's say you've got an Azure virtual machine. It's a standard A1_V2 virtual machine size. And with that virtual machine size, we don't have a whole lot of CPU and we don't have a whole lot of memory. But we could build a server using that virtual machine size as we're testing things out and kind of kicking the tires. And then later we can scale up vertically. We can go into the Azure portal, or we can do this from the command line, but we can make the virtual machine bigger by switching the virtual machine size to something like a standard _DS2_V2. And so, of course, the idea here is we can scale up vertically, basically make the virtual machine bigger than it was before. So it has more virtual CPUs, it's got more memory, it's perhaps got more virtual disks connected to it, more data disks, and it's just a bigger, more capable virtual machine. Now, again, this is typically seen when you're working with virtual machines, but there are other services where you might scale up some kind of resource. So for example, if you're working in Azure SQL, you might scale up the actual plan for your DTUs, your data transaction units. Or if you're working in the app service environment and you're hosting web applications, you might scale the app service plan up to a bigger plan that supports more resources. But that's basically the idea with scaling up vertically. You're making something bigger than it was previously, giving it more resources. And so typically scaling up vertically is a manual process, and that's where scaling horizontally becomes much more interesting. So for example, let's take a look at a common use case for scaling out horizontally. So if you're hosting a web application on something like Azure Virtual Machines, you probably start off with an Azure load balancer. And then behind the load balancer, of course, you're going to have at least a couple of virtual machines to start with. And of course, as users visit that load balancer, the public IP address or a DNS name connected to that IP address, the load balancer is going to distribute the connections across those two virtual machines. So very simple, very basic kind of concept here. Now this model becomes much more interesting when you're working with something like a virtual machine scale set, which is something we'll see here coming up in this module. And a scale set is basically a collection of virtual machines that can scale horizontally dynamically based on a set of rules. So for example, we might have a rule that says scale out anytime the average CPU is greater than 70%. So we see that for longer than 5 minutes, we can say, hey, let's go ahead and add another virtual machine to the scale set. And so this is something based on rules that can happen dynamically, and that's the idea of scaling out horizontally. We're adding another virtual machine that's just like the other two to the existing pool of servers. And as user requests continue to come into that load balancer, the load balancer is spreading things out across all the virtual machines, and we're taking the heavy load off those first two original virtual machines. Now, of course, when you scale out, there's going to be a time where the demand drops back down, and scaling in is going to be important as well because you want to be able to save on costs. You don't want to have idle infrastructure sitting there that's not serving any users. So again, we could create a scale in rule that says something like if the average CPU drops below 20% for 5 minutes, that means we need to delete a server from the scale set. And once that takes place, we've gone back to our original configuration, and you can see that we've got this kind of elastic architecture here. It expands and contracts based on a set of rules. So the cool thing is you can do this with your own virtual machines that you're building on your own in the Azure portal. You can do this with the app service environment. We're going to take a look at both of those scenarios. And there's going to be different spots throughout the platform where you can enable this concept of scalability. And we'll take a look at more of those examples as we move forward. But now that we understand the difference between vertical and horizontal scaling, let's move to the next video and we'll dive deeper into how these auto scaling rules actually work.